Yeah.
What time you think?
Go to 1:45, 10 to.
So, okay. Based on the schedule, it seems I'm talking about Iyob. I checked it up. Okay. Just to, in all of about 40 minutes, it's obviously impossible to do a exhaustive. Iyob is quite a large book, 42 chapters, and it's 42 dense chapters, very, very involved. What I'd like to do is just give a quick overview for a few minutes, and then give a little bit of a approach of how, or a distinction about how some of the Mefarshim looked at the book of Iyob throughout history, and maybe we'll see something interesting about the book of Iyob. So Iyob is, like I said, 42 chapters. The structure of the book basically introduces us to Iyob. Iyob, we're told, is a pious person, right, who fears God and does no wrong. Okay, we're introduced to him. We're introduced to he's also quite wealthy. He has got everything you want, right? Family, wealth, for everything you want, he's got. So it's like this picture perfect scene. Nothing's wrong. Then we're given a story. The story goes over the first 2 chapters. Very famous story. I don't think I have to repeat the story, but just, God sits amongst the angels, and the Satan goes with them, and God sort of like starts to needle the Satan. You see Iyob, and back and forth, and turns out that God enables the Satan to, quote unquote, test Iyob, to give him difficulties. Iyob still turns out to be, he stands the test of time. Then there's another meeting, and at the second meeting, again, the Satan enters, and God tells him, what about Iyob? He says, yes, but you've given me the ability to cause him all the suffering in the world, except what? Except touch him personally. So, in the interim, Iyob happens to lose his wealth, his children, his health, everything he loses. And then, that's the story. And then, Iyob's 3 friends approach him, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and they come and they spend almost the rest of the book to discuss it with him, his situation. Iyob starts, and Iyob starts to complain. The book is structured in 3s. So Iyob has 3 friends. He speaks, a friend speaks, he speaks, a friend speaks, he speaks, a friend speaks. That happens 3 times. There are 3 cycles of that. So he interacts with 3 people 3 times. And then, after that, a certain Elihu enters the scene. He speaks. And then what happens is that God comes down, and in some form of a maybe anticlimactic version, God rebukes everybody. Iyob, in the book, he seems to, at some point, engage in critiquing God. He knows he knows he's blameless, and he turns to God and challenges God's judgment. The three friends, each, so to speak, take an approach in defending God's judgment and trying to explain to Iyob why he is in the situation he's in. They try to explain to him why what has happened in defense of God's ultimate judgment, why what has happened to him, and why that's it. That's the structure of the book. Okay. Now, like I said, it's somewhat dense, and it engages in a lot of, so to speak, hyperbole. There's a lot of back and forth, and can we question God? Can we not question God? Throughout that entire book. Question is, what is the function? What is the purpose? What does the Tanakh want us to take out from this situation? So, what's interesting here is, if we look at it, already from the Talmudic times, there's a discussion who Iyob was, what is he was. But if we look at the commentary of Iyob over time, it evolves. There is a development in the 12th century of Perush. And this Perush, Hakamim have their approach in the Talmud, looking at it, discussing it. Hakamim discuss who the author would be, right? Some say it's the time of Moshe. There's a debate about who the author is. Clearly that shows that they're unclear who the author is. There's even an opinion in the Gemara that says that Iyob lo haya velo nivra, there was never such a person. This is a mashal. Okay. At some point, right, that's at the time of the Gemara. And then, of course, in the medieval times, we have these perush, parshanim, that really want to stick more to the peshat of the book, right? Sadia Gaon and others. But what happens in general, but most with Iyob, is in the 12th, 13th centuries, there's a shift in parshanut, certainly in Achmes Sfarad. Achmes Sfarad, who were Pashtanim, there's a shift. It comes around really Harambam's time, Ibn Tibbon and others, where new types of perush are created or written. And that perush is, from Achmes Sfarad, is a little less concerned with the pishat of the text that they're looking at, and more concerned with the theological applications of the book that they're explaining. So they're more than willing to create a metaphor to the book, and they'll write a book in a manner, or they'll write a perush in a manner that certain philosophical secrets are hidden in the book. And there we have to decode the book, right? One of the starkest examples of that is interesting, no other than a figure of the Ramah. This is much a little bit later. Rabbi Moshe Israelis, who wrote the famous Hagahot, his Perush on Megillat Esther, called Mihir Yain, where he writes it as a whole philosophical treatise, right? With these philosophical involvements, that's what's happening. So, with Iyob, because the book is ripe for this type of perush, right? For this type of looking at the world and trying to make sense of suffering. Jewish people had no sort of lack of suffering, and in any century. So certainly, the book of Iyob becomes a book where we can ponder the meaning of man and the meaning of suffering and all of that. Now, whether that's its function within the Peshat, I mean, on some level, yes, but what happens when we get to that type of is everyone pours in to that book what they believe the meaning to be, right? Based on their ideologies or whatever it is, and it now becomes a perfect book to look at all sorts of thinking, all the way, by the way, all the way down to, from early commentaries all the way down to the Malbim. These types of Perushim are discussed and written about Sefre Iyob. Right? So we have this work and what it means in terms of our connection to Iyob, right? How do we view Iyob's, at some point, heretical statements, right? What type of heresy is he discussing? Right, the Gemara already says, Afar l'pumei de Iyob, and Iyob himself is a funny figure within the text of the book. Why? Because on the one hand, Iyob begins very pious. After the first string of suffering, he makes the famous statement that everybody knows, that we all, I think it's said at every single funeral, right? Right? Hashem Natan, Hashem Lakar, Hashem. That's Iyob, right? That's Iyob. The statement of acceptance, the statement of piety, and nevertheless, at some point, he shifts to challenging God, to engaging HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? And his friends are incensed at that. At the end of the book, God, when he comes down, and he does rebuke Iyob, but he sort of pardons him by not demanding that Iyob bring a sacrifice, as opposed to, ironically, the three friends, right? They have to bring sacrifice. Why? Ki lo dibartem iti nechora. Right? You haven't spoke truth like my servant Iyob. Right? Interesting. So Iyob has this, we'll call this sort of sandwich: pious, heretic, and then beloved by God and pious. And at the end of the book, of course, Iyob gets, it's hard to say gets everything back, because those who die, and those who, right? But he's given, so to speak, a wealth, he's given family, he's given children, and it looks like almost this perfect bookends with just a difficult thing in the middle. But as many Mefarshim point out, losing X amount of children, when you have new ones, you still lost the children, right? In other words, the tragedy is still struck. But the books paint a picture that this was all a excursion, and at the end of the day, he's just as good off as where he started. That's somewhat of the structure. And what we do, and what the Mefarshim do with this interaction, becomes very interesting throughout Jewish history and throughout the Parshanim. How they engage in this work becomes a interesting exercise. So much so that no less than Rambam, who has which we'll talk about, who has 2 chapters in the Moreh Nebuchim on this book, in it he says, makes this type of a statement. He says, the book is all repetitive, with no real hidush, except some few verses here and there, and that's where you need to see what's unique about the three friends. Otherwise, they're just all repeating each other. To no hidush. And he seems to indicate, in true Rambam fashion, that that's done on purpose. Why? To hide it. Right? You need to hide, so to speak, the truth that's buried inside. So there's a lot of hyperbole. And in his mind, the approach to Iyob is not to necessarily engage in every pasuk and all the hyperbole, but to extract the tremendous wisdom buried within these psukim that are hidden in there, and to understand, therefore, by then and there, the distinction between each, what's represented by Iyob and his three friends. And when you do that, you will extract the wisdom, right? And then he engages with Elihu, and of course, Kadosh Baruch Hu at the end. So what is acknowledged here is that the book is very, like I said, extremely dense, difficult. It's the words, it's the concepts are difficult, and of course the concept of what becomes known as Sadik Veralo, Rasha V'Tovlo. That is what we look at in this book, how we understand what's buried here. Okay. As I mentioned, the commentary here starts from Hazal, right? Hazal look at the book, they're questioning it. The idea of Sadik Veralo, Rasha V'Tovlo is throughout Hazal, but not only throughout Hazal, but throughout itself Tanakh, right? You see Abraham Avinu, Hashofet Kol Haaretz Lo Yaseh Mishpat, all the good suffer with the wicked. Interestingly enough, in Tanakh, the problem of Tzadik V'Ralo Rasha V'Tovlo, the problem that they're bothered with more is the Rasha V'Tovlo side, right? Yirmiyah questions God a little bit, not because of his problems as much as, right, as the Lama Derech Rishaim. Yeah, why do the Rasha V'Tovlo? Why does these people, talks about his hometown of Anatot, and why are they in such everything seems to be so good for them, smash them a little bit, So that points out to this theological question that the ancients, medievals, moderns, all struggle with. One can imagine even till today. And here becomes a book that hopefully has the answer, right? Because you have this guy, he was righteous, and he has untold amount of suffering. So hopefully, somewhere in this book, we can find the answer of answers in the text of Tanakh to the most difficult of questions to grapple with. Harambam, like others, as well sees this. And Harambam, he takes the idea of Tzadik Veralo, Rasha V'Tovlo, and Hashgacha Pratit, and he believes hidden in this book is all the approaches ever discussed of God's interaction with man is in this book. And Rambam, in the Moreh elsewhere, talks about different approaches to God. Hashgacha Pratit. Okay? To him, there are 5 main approaches. Those who don't believe in God, there's no Hashgacha. They don't believe in Him. So we don't. There is an Aristotelian approach. The Aristotelian approach is that God doesn't. It is beneath God to engage in this lowly world, right? That God's Hashgacha is limited to the upper spheres of the heavens, represented in His world by the planetary orbits around the earth, which represent a deeper understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu than we do. They're somewhere in between the Malachim and us, and therefore these planetary orbits do merit God's Hashgacha and Yedi'ah. Again, to Aristotle, Hashgacha and Yedi'ah come together. God's foreknowledge and His Hashgacha extend there. So, to our lowly world, God doesn't care, doesn't know, doesn't want to see, and that's it. Obviously, that idea of Hashgacha means that what happens in this world is absolutely and totally haphazard, randomness, mikre. Then he discusses different forms of philosophical discussions among certain Muslim philosophy that God rules based on His will, that the world may not make sense because it's all based on God's will. Then he talks about another group that God rules the world based on what He knows to be true, that God's hashgacha is on every single living, and this both groups agree, on everything in the world. It's the opposite of Aristotle, that everything in the world is run specifically at the desire of God. Even any leaf that falls from the tree, everything comes down to God's or will or knowledge, based on how things should be. What happens when we see certain things that don't run that way, or that don't seem to make sense? So there's certain standard answers. You don't know. You don't know. You think you know. You don't know what's really good, what's really bad. You don't really understand how things are supposed to run. Harambam talks about the opinion of the Torah itself, in which there is a specific, everything is based on divine justice. That everything that happens to man is a direct result of his actions. Okay? It's pure sachar va'onish in a perfect world. And therefore, if you do A, you get B, and God's divine justice is perfect. Okay? Now, what happens? And basically, Rambam will set the stage that the Eliphaz represents Torah approach, and Bildad and Safad represent two different Islamic thoughts, and Iyob represents an Aristotelian heresy. That's his heresy, is the Aristotelian heresy. And that's, he sees the world as random. And he engages the world as random. And that's how he looks at this. And in fact, you could imagine within those philosophical structures that I just mentioned, what will happen. We'll always hear a lot of, you don't know, God knows, whether it's based on His will, whether it's His justice, you just don't know. You don't know what's happening. How do you think you know? You must have sinned, Eliphaz says. You must have, but I didn't, Iyob says. And the reader is at the, so to speak, we have an edge on everybody because we know the whole story. We know the first two chapters that nobody else in the book knows. We know Iyob did sin.
Did he sin?
Did not. We know he did not sin. We know that. But, so we're watching the story, and we know, so to speak, the answer before, right? It's like when you see a mystery book, and you're told from the first page who did it, okay? Well, we know the who done it here. But they're engaging. They're trying, and that's why Rambam says all of the you don't knows that are said, those are psukim that are there just in repetitive, so sort of to cloud the scene for us, so we shouldn't. And what the ideal answer here is in Harambam saying is that what we know at the end of the day that there was a group that are engaged in the story that nobody thought about. Harambam says, but Elihu did. And who's involved that nobody realized was involved? The angels. We didn't pay attention to them. Everybody thought what? That this is the direct result of God's hashgacha. But We know that this has nothing to do, quote unquote, with God. This is what that the angels are engaged. Now, what does that mean? What does this mean? So first of all, two intros to that. Harambam's opinion about Hashgaha is that yes, as the Torah tells us, everybody gets his due, sachar va'onesh. But there's another funny thing here, is that who says you are allowed or given the benefit of the purest of Hashgaha, right? He says this, Rabbi Abraham ben Harambam says it in the Maspik, that Be'emet, just as an ant merits what he calls a Hashgaha klalit, right? A Hashgaha over the species, but not a specific Hashgaha prati, so too does people who are evil, let's say, or not even just evil, but who actually do not engage HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly in their lives. They're peripheral. Their involvement with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is peripheral to their existence. They may do certain things and this and that, but they're much more interested in benefits of this world, right? They are more interested in the type of car they drive than engaging in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They may engage Hashem on the side, but that's not their function. In that sense, a sort of a midah keneged midah, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will engage them on that same level. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right, they will be, so to speak, also on his periphery, so to speak, which means that his hashgaha onto them could be limited, as opposed to the Navi and Sadiq, who is fully connected with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So therefore, it might come out that their engagement with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is somewhat limited, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu's engagement with them in their hashgaha is also somewhat limited. Another point that he points out is that Iyob is praised as being what? A righteous individual. But he's not praised with what? With tremendous wisdom. And so therefore, he doesn't really understand things. He has not engaged with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, what would make sense is that he's given over, on some level, to other causes. And therefore, what are those other causes? Rambam doesn't say this. Allow me to a little bit interpret. What are those other causes? Well, what is a malach? Rambam has in the Moreh a few interpretations of what the word malach means. One is as an angelic being, but one could be other external causes. Okay? And basically, what Rambam is telling us is that it could very well be that Iyob, not being a particularly wise person in the beginning, right? Distraught by suffering, doesn't know how to deal with it, and gives into heretical views. However, by the end of the story, he has learned much, and therefore will merit in God's ultimate hashgaha. So the story of Iyob becomes the story of how we grapple with suffering, but how we understand it, merging two interesting concepts. One of Rambam is Hashgaha Prati, and the other is Sadiq Veralo. And Rambam has this famous, that Sadiq Veralo doesn't come, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not Osir Ra, ever. But Ra happens. The Tzaddik Veralo question is either Ra doesn't happen, so you have to just assume you don't know what you're talking about, right? Because it's not Ra, there's no such thing. But if Ra does happen, Harambam will say, it's because of all other factors. Either it might be a factor of man on man, or natural disasters on man that automatically happen, or most likely man on himself. Right? This is it. So Iyob becomes the individual who really, in a certain sense, because of his lack of understanding and engagement intellectually of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he doesn't get it. The friends don't get it either, right? But why is God angrier at the friends? Because they weren't even speaking truthfully. At least, even in Iyob's heresy, he was true to his word. And then when Elihu comes, and he clarifies everything, God comes down and gives a moral lesson. Where were you when the earth was created? How do you know? And what are you to judge me? And everything like that. And then again, this becomes the paradigm of really, at least in Harambam's world, of where we, where things are. How much time, more time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay. So this is one example of that. Yeah.
So for Harambam, if you attain prophecy or understanding of God's role, then you'll never experience Ra.
You'll never experience that.
So how do prophets suffer?
Right. So let me put it this way. If you are in the prophet of the connectedness of Moshe Rabbeinu, you will never experience Ra. If you, to the degree of your lack of connectedness, you might experience Ra. Now, of course, the one that we really want to look at in that is one of the greatest prophets, which Yirmiyah, who seems to claim to experience Ra, right? He seems to.
Not seem to, he does.
Right? He experiences Ra, right? In a sense, this is one thing I didn't get involved in, but it's crucial, which I should mention now, which is crucial in the Moreh, which he also will say that part of Iyob's foolishness is to take things that shouldn't be taken seriously, to take it seriously. Man is here to what? To ponder HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he goes through how we take things important, right? And he says, a person, to the tremendously shallow person, his wealth is important to him. And then his family on a deeper level. And then claims even those who can handle the destruction of family cannot handle the destruction of self, health, and things like that. In a sense, and here is the interesting, in a sense, all of that is heaven compared to the engagement of the divine. And he goes into this whole idea of man is supposed to be brought to engage with the divine. How that exactly figures into this system, it's left a little unclear. Because, Rambam, it sounds like he's not willing to admit Ra, because it doesn't make a difference anything, and as long as you understand Kadosh Baruch Hu. But Rambam begins willing to admit Ra. But the evil's brought on, so again, it seems, and the Ra is self-inflicted. The more man leaves his function of someone who engages at Kadosh Baruch Hu, the more he is able to experience Ra. In theory, a person who is connected 24/7 and a Navi Tzaddik who's connected should, like you said, in this idea, never experience Ra. Yeah.
That tells me that Ra is something perhaps subjective to the individual, meaning if the person climbs up that ladder of prophecy, then
he won't care about it. In other words, it may be just so irrelevant that even if you see it happening, who cares?
in the world of objectivity, the two things that are the same can happen to two different people. One person who's higher on the ladder of prophecy will experience the same action towards him, but will not have the same reaction.
Right.
And that's perhaps what this idea of Ra is. It's subjective to that individual.
Okay.
Is Harambam talking about the interpretation of Ra or actual suffering? It sounds like he's talking about actual suffering.
Yeah, so it's a flip, I think. I mean, that's exactly. In other words, he begins with the discussion of actual suffering, but he then looks at it as and different, and the typology of a person who looks at what type of suffering it is, and just like to many people, the loss of wealth should not be considered suffering. In the end of the book, he said, all olam hazeh, anything that happens in this world really shouldn't be considered suffering, as long as you're able to connect to a Kadosh Baruch Hu. I mean, that's how he sort of frames it. And does that mean that he negates the idea of Ra the way he started? It's not so pashut, but yeah.
I'm gonna say, like, even Moshe Rabbeinu experiences stuff, like the end of his life is a very painful scene. So if you're
Right.
because you're mentioning that,
Right.
let's say
To us, it's a
I
painful
realize
scene.
Moshe,
To Moshe Rabbeinu, although he prays to go into Eretz Yisrael, way Harambam describes Moshe Rabbeinu's death is just exactly how he says it. It's just the next step. You know, he got to the point of the highest point of a man can get in this world, and death to him is just an equivocal term that we use for ourselves because your neshama leaves your body. But it's lo haya klum, nothing. It was just okay, as if to say neshama, okay body, I have to go now, and that's it. Literally, this is the way he describes it. It was just, it's lenu, it becomes death, but to him, it was just the thing. It was just, he got to that point. So, yeah.
That's an interesting observation that the Tanakh was canonized, and this final Iyob chapter is the last time God appears in the Tanakh, and Iyob has the last word.
Right, in a certain sense. I mean, the order of books of Ketubim is still debatable, but right, Ketubim certainly is not. Ketubim is certainly not a book of revelation, divine revelation to human beings, right? You don't see direct communication of God to man a lot in Ketubim, right? I always say Ketubim is more of the book where we sort of communicate, right? Tehillim, right? Mishle, we sort of communicate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu or to ourselves, right? We don't see, certainly, very little in the Megillot, where God interacts with man. Right. Minus Divrei Hayamim, but Divrei Hayamim is a book of, history, but yeah, right?
Does it mean anything?
So, it's hard to know, because it's interesting. In other words, let's say it this way. It leaves us with some questions. In other words, you know how Jews do it? They answer a question with a question, right? This is like a real rabbinic fashion. It leaves us with as many questions as we started with. It doesn't give us this, and this is, I think, more than anything. I said it in a half-joking manner, but in a sense, this is probably the most important, If this was written by I don't know what, a secular or maybe a Christological approach, this book would need to have clear-cut answers to every question it brought up. It would need to say, you asked A, God has to come down and resolve all the questions. But in a tremendous Jewish fashion, and here I really mean a tremendous Jewish fashion, it engages the process of engaging the question itself is the point. And the complete answer at the end, you are a human being in this physical world and you're attempting to engage the divine. God says that this is not going to work. It's just not going to work. Not that you can't answer. It's just it's just not going to work. So that's why I said anticlimactic. You expect God to come down and resolve all the questions. And I remember when I was a kid and first was introduced to this book, and I'm saying, okay, God's coming now. And then I'm saying, he said, what? Like you're all upset. Like I want to know the answers, and it's just not going to give you the answers to your questions, right? And I think that escapes any perush you want. I don't have much time, but I would recommend. I wanted to segue into another commentary, which is the Malbim itself. The Malbim, he is very impacted by Harambam here, but the way he engages in Iyob is very interesting, because he brings an added component into Iyob. Iyob, according to the Malbim, flips between everything is unfair, the world is unfair, and parts of the reason why the world is unfair, he flips between the idea that God doesn't care about individuals, God cares about running his world, and he doesn't care about us or about the individuals because we are insignificant. And he flips between that and saying that what? That there is this, so to speak, impossibility of me engaging with God because he is all powerful, and the case or the competition, so to speak, of that man-God engagement, it's just not fair, right? And there's much more to that. It's just not, it's set up, the deck of cards is set up against us.
This is Malbim?
Yeah, and there's much more there. I didn't get really of a chance, but it's also a unique approach to understanding Iyob and impacted by Rambam, but with a 19th century tinge on it, which is very interesting because he is impacted by later movements, and it's also an interesting work to discuss. We don't have time, but to see how the commentary on Iyob almost develops based on new philosophical teachings and how that is inserted, and to see how different commentaries interpret Iyob in their quest to understand the Holy Grail, the answer of questions to all questions in the work of Iyob. I'll take if there's any questions, I'll take.
We're in a postmodernist world.
Yeah, I'm never sure what that means, but I got it. Yeah.
Postmodernist world means they can't, there's no answer.
There's no right.
There's no answer, which is what Iyob, sort of, the book of Iyob.
Right.
sort of
So,
teaches. Okay, there's no answer.
Right. So,
So I guess.
postmodernism means a lot of stuff, right? It means there's no good, there's no bad, everything's relevant, ethics. So there's so much in that. I'm not good with terms, so to speak, and that term means a lot of things, so we should be careful. But I would say like this, in the sense of, to at least that Rambam was reading, is that in a sense to the idea of man grappling with the divine in his human, carnal existence, you have to be satisfied with the engagement of the discourse. And to fully get it, even Moshe Rabbeinu could. So just, that's it. Is it the struggle? Is it the human tragedy, so to speak, in a sense that he is human and physical? Maybe, but that's sort of where it is.
How do you explain, as presented to us here in the story, that Hashem lets this other entity of this destruction, so to speak, like.
Again, according to at least according to Rambam, that's how we exist, right? That's the source of Ra becomes certain things that we allow to happen to ourselves, and those are the external entities in this world, and that becomes a source of Ra. Chalosh Baruch Hu Kulo Tov.
So the Satan is an outside source that we.
The Satan is like Elihu says in the Malach. That's what it is. By the way, I didn't have time to do that, but the Satan is, Rambam writes clearly in the Moreh, Hu Satan, Hu Malach HaMavet, V'hu Yesahara, which says a lot. Hu Satan, Hu Malach HaMavet, V'hu Yesahara. Yored, he comes down, he deceits. He goes up, he prosecutes. And then after, he actually carries out the sentence. So he's the deceiver, the prosecutor, and the ultimate destroyer. That's Satan. Rambam, that's a Gemara, and Rambam quotes that Gemara quite often in this in that chapter. Okay. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen.